These are images of the state where my parents were born and raised and where I was born and raised. This is where I learned to walk, drive a car, spent 18 years of my life, and then left, the first chance I got. When looking beyond the overwhelming natural beauty, the state of West Virginia has distinctive socioeconomic and cultural disparities that I believe are often overlooked by the rest of the nation, only to get generally negative attention when crisis does strike.
Virginia was Trump's best state, and in the past 6 years, folks there have downed 780 million hydro and oxycodone pills. That's 433 pain pills for every person in the state. West Virginia's mascot is a dilated pupil.
Unfortunately, whether you like Bill Maher or not, these statistics are accurate. Over the last few years, the international community has become aware of West Virginia's population through the aid of news broadcasting and specifically for being home to the overdose capital of the United States. It has gained so much attention, in fact, that several documentaries have focused on the West Virginia opioid crisis. Finger pointing and blaming aside of who or what the culprit is that caused the problem in the first place, the question I seek to answer is, how has the face of rapidly changing Appalachian society, in particular, the changing roles and mechanisms in masculinity, influenced these continuously rising statistics? That is, could opioid use and overdose rates to some extent be an unintended outcome of a marginalized male population? I will review historical and societal changes that have rebranded Appalachian masculinity, the state of healthcare, health literacy, health attitudes, culture and geographic isolation, financial disparities, and health population trends in male opioid use to link these concepts. So, how do you define Appalachia? And this population I'll be looking at. Appalachia, or the Appalachian Mountain region, consists of 13 states ranging from New York to Mississippi, which includes West Virginia, Kentucky, Pennsylvania, the Carolinas, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, Maryland, Virginia, Ohio, and the southern part of New York, and settlement in this area began in the 18th century. The demographic population I'll actually be focusing on will be the region of Central Appalachia. One of the things that makes my home state, West Virginia, unique is the fact that it lies entirely within the Appalachian region. Since settlement, Appalachia has been a distinctive cultural and geographic area. The Appalachian Mountains were commonly referred to as the backcountry or the Appalachian frontier, and the typical Appalachian pioneer was often viewed as self-sufficient and rugged. Think of kind of the personification of Daniel Boone. And male settlers to this region practiced mostly hunting or subsistence farming, which meant just farming enough for a single family. So these families were moving from the East Coast into the Appalachia region really just to live entirely off the land and support a family. It was a very simple approach to life. Early pioneers to this region were essentially cut off from the rest of the settled East Coast due to the mountains, and this really required a lot of self-reliance, but also played into the increasing poverty as time went on, which is still continuing today. And overall, this area has really been entrenched in poverty for its entire history. So beyond the pioneers who moved into Appalachia to live a simple life and support their family off the land, you also saw a large number of people moving to the area to escape the East Coast. And a specific example of this was the development of the Melungeon race. And this was a distinct racial ethnic minority, likely seeking solitude from the settled East. There's thought to still be millions of descendants today, and this actually really made up a large percentage of the culture and what was going on in the isolated Appalachia. So studies have shown that the genetic admixture of the modern-day Appalachian descendants as Sephardic Jews, Ashkenazi Jewish, Mediterranean, Spanish, Portuguese, Turkish, Native American, Sub-Saharan African, Romani, and probably more beyond that. It was likely that they were able to escape and live within these communities where they didn't have to face racism, although the term Melungeon was still being used as a racial slur. Although, as I've discussed, Appalachia has always been entrenched in poverty, the Civil War really marked a historical timeline when social influence started to affect the Appalachian people. So during the Civil War, Appalachia continued to grow poorer and went underfunded. And they experienced extreme violence and turmoil as the war entered the area, and war tactics left the region even more fearful and mistrusting the federal government in the years to come. And these people felt abandoned by the politicians who had promised them better outcomes. So if you look right here, I mean, this is the Appalachian region, but this is also where you saw Union and Confederates meeting up for battle. So you had these families that were having Union and Confederate soldiers coming into their homes for a place to stay, for shelter, and demanding to be fed, and then leaving and completely destroying some of the agricultural initiatives they had going on, some homes, and just their overall peace. And then when we move forward a little bit more, the industrialization of the Western Highland Appalachia did not actually occur until the post-Civil War to help feed the Americans' consumption. So you had a little bit of industry occurring at this time, more towards the east, on the eastern side of Appalachia, but that area I highlighted there had really no large industry going on. So as America started to become more connected nationally, while surveying the land in 1854, Frederick Olmsted traveled to the backcountry of Appalachia and reported back some rather crude comments. He said that these people were open-hearted, frank and kindly, but undereducated and unaware of society east of the Appalachian Mountains. They lived in rude fashion in small and comfortless log huts. They practiced ineffective, backwards farming, and he believed that the introduction of the railroad to this area would greatly improve their lives. So thus, the expansion of the railroads began into Appalachia post-Civil War, and this railway expansion allowed Appalachia to start exporting some of their natural resources of lumber, agriculture, oil, and it also opened up numerous coal mines to fuel trains, which started to shape the transition of subsistence farming to men going out to the coal mines and factories to work. So the opening of the coal mines and exportation of natural resources did not actually banish the backcountry traditions of the barter system or subsistence farming. And you saw a mixed fusion of traditional living with urbanization. So while some men went to work in mines and factories, others were still living off the land. Additionally, this industry ideally was capitalism and resulted in unethical contracts where these men were putting in long hours and hard labor for low wages, or in kind wages, which just meant enough goods to support themselves and their family, or company scrip wages, which tricked these men into thinking that they were getting some sort of tangible money, when in reality, a company scrip, as you see below, was a substitution for legal currency that can be exchanged for in stores owned by the employer for goods. And this subsidization of labor did allow for products to be priced lower than competitors, but it set up a population entirely dependent on federal support. And at this point, we're talking the late 1800s, early 1900s. This is not a good start to working into the mainstream culture. And industrial labor subsidization also shifted most of Appalachian revenue to outside enterprises. By 1929, you have the Great Depression, and these industries have basically been shut down. And by 1940, despite a population boom, the population has dropped again. By the early 20th century, West Virginia politics have been taken over by pro-industrialist senators. The backcountry entrepreneurs that did exist have been bought out by outside corporations. And then by 1950, due to the Great Depression, mechanization of the coal industry, which meant fewer men were required in the coal mine due to technological advancements, many of these Appalachian men were unemployed, and once again, these families were deep-rooted in poverty. And overall, the industrialization resulted in very few Appalachian men and families actually gaining wealth rather than increasing the overall poverty. And additionally, they were left with this land that had been sabotaged by overforestation and a total depletion of arable land. So they lacked land where they could actually grow food on. Fast forwarding to 1978, we have the Appalachian Land Ownership Survey, which showed that 40% of property is owned by corporations, whereas 60% is private land ownership, and 70% of mineral rights are owned by corporations. Another study was done in 2011, which showed that the 60% of private land ownership in 1978 had dropped to 17.6% in 2011. In the photo on the left, it shows West Virginia land ownership patterns and how they reflect a history with the influence of politics and corporate economic growth. So in 6 counties, the top 10 landowners own 50% or more of the county's private land. Moving into some of the issues of the rural Appalachian low-income male and how his role has changed, especially in a changing family. A lot of this information is based off an article I found that was published in 1979. I was having a lot of issues finding articles that delve into this particular topic, and I think one of the issues is that because this whole region of the U.S. is so entrenched in poverty, that these states don't really have funding sources to do research on stuff like this. So it would take an outside source and interest to look at more modern representations of this information. But also 1979 really isn't that long ago. That's 39 years ago. So you still have a lot of these men that were fathers and boys alive today. 1950 to 1980 represented the most profound changes to the construct of the Appalachian family due to industrialization and affiliated modernization. Rural Appalachian families actually differ in some ways from other rural regions of the U.S., which are dominated by commercial agriculture. This area of the U.S. is not dominated by that for the same reasons that we can go back to with deforestation and depletion of arable land. 1940 to 1960, rural Appalachia starts to integrate psychologically and socially with mainstream American society. And the consequences of this, where Appalachians were under the pressure to catch up and conform to their middle-class equals in urbanized areas. Some of the big changes that were seen post-1970 to the traditional Appalachian male role was the Appalachian male as a provider and husband, as a primary decision maker, as a male role in child rearing, and the Appalachian male as a sexual partner. Here are some of the traditional Appalachian folk values that characterize the male role: a strong sense of family, emphasis on masculinity, religion and puritanism, rugged individualism, self-sufficiency, fatalism, which is events that are predetermined and unavoidable, traditionalism, person-oriented rather than object-oriented, existence orientation rather than improvement orientation, which I'll talk about in just a bit, life in harmony with nature, and values that were not held as rigidly and still are not are educational achievement, economical achievement, and materialism. Perhaps the most important aspect of the traditional Appalachian family is kinship. Children grow up in a circle of kin. Most often, these kin groups are composed of the male kindred. They're made up by immediate family, extended family, and neighboring households. The kinship circle has a high importance in shaping of the isolated rural male role, and male kin are the most influential over learned behavior. So in the kin group, there's a high reliance on the circle of kin for meaningful social interaction, support and mutual aid, loyalty, friendship, information about the world, social and psychological identification, and learning of social boundaries. So some of the values of kinship up until the 1970s included that the head of the kinder group is usually the oldest male, or the father. Younger brothers and sons serve as secondary leaders. The men were in charge of making decisions for the family group and determine the family group attitude. Kinship entails service to other members of the kin, as the men is expected by default to help out his kin with skills such as car repair, carpentry, farming, helping in times of crisis and illness, and diffusing issues with those outside of the family group. Wife and children are seen as subordinates. Sex roles were clearly defined: boys and men as laborers, girls and women as homemakers. Boys went to work with the father in the coal mines or in the fields. Girls stayed home with the mother to learn domestic duties. And ideally, children were expected by 16 to be of full adult status. For instance, in the subsistence farming family structure, the men of the household did all the farming labor. The father would be the head of the household as long as he was putting in labor. The eldest son would take over roles as the father aged, and the father still directed activities in the household as long as he was able. And he was a full authority on all agricultural sales, and the wife served as a consultation. The mining family structure was a little bit different because it wasn't as family-oriented, because the male was the sole economic provider. There was a need for physical strength for financial security of family, and this resulted in male dominance in the household. So some of the changes that started to begin in the 1970s that started to redefine gender role expectations, especially for the men of the household, were that women were taking jobs outside of the home, women equality including decision-making, expecting assistance with household chores, children bringing home new ideas from mainstream cultures and challenging the ideas of their elders, seeing portrayals on TV of sex roles, morals, family life. Education and materialism became dominant values. And this produced stress in the whole family, but especially for the adult male who's expected to implement these values, but he's lacked the means and the resources to do this. So the Appalachian male's traditional family structure has been undermined, and he's not really sure how to adjust. There were three ways that it was observed that these Appalachian men took to conforming to mainstream culture. The first was acceptance and integration, second, difficult or marginal adjustment, and third, rejection with retreatism and deviant behavior. For those who fell into marginal adjustment or rejection, had these characteristics: extreme social isolation, extreme physical isolation, inadequate small farms with total deforestation and severe erosion with few or no alternatives for income, high educational disparities, strong fatalistic attitudes, Puritanism, which meant highly conservative moral beliefs, especially regarding sex indulgence, self-indulgence in sex, traditionalism, individualism, which meant that they were used to being self-reliant and independent, and there was very little social organization outside the family kin. So there was not a lot of opportunity for non-kin and larger society contact outside of welfare programs and school systems. And this was all influenced by the traditional male-centered folk subculture, and mainstream society upset this whole structure in the matter of a few years. Overall, what the authors noticed is that traditional lifestyle did not cultivate adaptive skills or incentive of adjusting to new or different situations. Some of the challenges that these men faced and are still facing today when being pressured to conform to mainstream culture are that these men often do not want to be on welfare, but they struggle to find jobs due to geographic isolation and a lack of transportation, a lack of formal education, and some even just refuse to conform to a modern economy. Unemployment and acceptance of welfare deeply goes against the Appalachian folk male subculture, and this results in internal conflict of masculinity as a role of a provider and husband. So these men feel as if they have lost the respect of the family and the community. They have a low self-confidence, loss of individualism. These men are also generally person-oriented rather than object-oriented. So that means that their status is based on personality and masculinity rather than material possessions. Fortunately, the wife and the family are often understand and support this man emotionally, but the lack of employment opportunities, increasing welfare dependencies, has led to an adaptation of urban poverty culture into rural poverty culture, which we'll see again coming up. There's a continued fear to adapt with larger society due to perceived obstacles and reinforcement of past failures. And as a result, these men sometimes retreat back into traditionalism and family. So they spend a lot of time being close with nature, doing things like fishing and hunting with other males. And this is an attempt to preserve tradition, but a preservation of old cultural attributes and an alienation from the larger society. And sometimes this can result in the justification to reject the pressure of modern society. And this is found to make up entire Appalachian neighborhoods. And from my personal experience, I can testify that that is still true. The males in the family may be considered deviant from the larger middle class society. And this is important to know that it's not synonymous with disorganized. It's actually quite organized because, again, it's a preservation of old cultural attributes. But it just appears bizarre and deviant and non-traditional to the larger society. The challenges that men have faced in being pressured to conform to mainstream culture also largely influences the challenges to rural healthcare in Appalachia, where there's greater distances to travel for healthcare. Because of poverty, they may lack transportation, overall lack of access to healthcare facilities that actually support healthy behaviors. Significantly more women have Medicaid and Medicare than men. And so that means that in a state where there's a lot of people that function off of welfare, that means that there's a lot of men who are entirely uninsured. And men who do not have a checkup in the last 5 years account for 26.5% of the male population in Appalachia. And women who have not had a routine checkup in the last 5 years is 16.6%. So you do see a larger amount of men not following up and keeping up to date on their health. And there are specific male barriers to healthcare in Appalachia. So despite the challenges previously referenced, many rural men choose to remain living in these rural areas as this is a complete preference. And they think that it's because rural isolation translates to a higher level of personal control and the maintenance of individual freedoms by staying isolated. A view of rural Appalachian men, the doctors are not equal. their representations of the larger mainstream society because they're not like them. They don't hunt or fish. And there's a general mistrust of both the medical system and the government from historical roots, and the overall belief that medicine is a reflection of what the government wants rural men to do, especially since they are on Medicare and Medicaid in order to go to their doctor appointments. Self-reliance and independence practiced in traditional Appalachian folk masculinity often prevents men from seeking health care, as they are the best judges of their personal health and fitness. There's a general mistrust of medical standards and the measures of health set by others as reliable. There's a denial that others can affect personal health, kind of a fatalism attitude. A reluctance to change is recommended by the physician. Ain't nobody going to tell me what to do. Personal definition of health, absence of any problems that would cause a decline in physical functioning. If you feel healthy, then you are healthy. And real men do not go to the doctor. And those are quotes taken out of a study on Appalachian men and healthcare barriers. These are some of the more dramatic West Virginia population health demographics when focusing on West Virginia as a sample of the Appalachian region. So West Virginia is the worst in the nation for employment rate, disability rate. That's 17.6% of working age people are disabled. They're the worst in the nation for a bachelor's degree, preventable hospitalizations, accidental death, drug overdoses, population that smokes, infectious diseases per 100,000 people, poor mental health days, poor physical health days, and as well worse in chronic disease for hypertension, diabetes, and obesity. Additionally, a study done in 2016 looking at states for overall well-being, West Virginia ranked as the worst in the nation when looking at factors such as purpose, social, financial, community, and physical. Some of the West Virginia statistics that differ significantly between men and women include suicide, where West Virginia is 11th worst in the nation. 81.6 suicides are performed by men versus 18.4% by women. Men have a higher HIV and AIDS incidence, and in 2011, there were 43 fatal occupational injuries, and 100% of these were male and 100% were Caucasian, affecting mostly men between ages 45 and 54. The occupations with the most fatalities included mining, transportation, construction, utility workers, and trade, and the most common causes of death were transportation incidences, objects and equipment falling, and falls. Speaking in terms of just rural America, some of the mental health challenges presented include recent social changes and rising social inequality in the rural United States have affected the experience and meaning of mental illness and treatment seeking within rural communities. In general, rural Americans face serious mental health disparities, and this includes higher rates of suicide and depression compared with residents of urban areas, and substance abuse rates in rural areas that are now equal to those in urban areas, which if we reference back to the change of how men were changing in the 70s, you saw the same type of economic disparities in urban areas entering rural Appalachia. And despite these increased risks, people living in rural areas are less likely than their urban counterparts to seek or receive mental health services. This is a pie chart looking at West Virginia for how many people between the years of 2010 and 2014 actually received treatment for illicit drug use. And you'll see that 86.7% of individuals who are drug users in West Virginia, but in that time, did not receive any type of formal treatment. And only 13.3% actually did receive treatment. And I would assume that probably at least half of those didn't do it by choice and it was court ordered. This is a table taken from a 2011 study which examined gender differences in substance use and age of first use among rural Appalachian drug users. And this particular table examines the differences in the onset of use regarding age between men and women. And you can see that some of the more significant age differences for when men start earlier than women include alcohol, hydrocodone, benzos, methamphetamine, marijuana, and hallucinogens. Cocaine and crack are a little bit more similar, but one thing I found really interesting is that there really is no significant difference between illicit methadone, OxyContin, other oxycodone, and heroin. So really the only thing that you see men starting earlier when it comes to opioids are going to be hydrocodone and benzos. This is a table taken from the same study, observing lifetime and past 30-day substance use characteristics. Some of the highlights that were found were that significantly more males reported lifetime and past 30-day use of alcohol. More males report lifetime use, including heroin, crack cocaine, methamphetamine, marijuana, and hallucinogens. There was a male preference for heroin and marijuana use in the past 30 days. Higher rates of lifetime drug use are found among men, and findings suggest overall male preference in lifetime past 30-day and age of first use for illegal and illicit drugs. This is what some other studies have to say regarding Appalachian drug use and gender differences. Studies examining overall sex differences in heroin use in a non-region-specific way have found that males have a more prevalent lifetime substance dependence diagnosis. Evidence suggests individuals in rural Appalachia lack access to basic preventative health services and have an overwhelming feeling of powerlessness over changing individual situations. Alcohol abuse exists in Appalachian people despite predominant religious beliefs among the Appalachian culture which prohibits its use. Gender differences in substance use have been attributed to traditional gender stereotypes, differing social stigmas, as well as opportunities to use. It is suggested elevated rates of non-medical use of prescription drugs may be related to the high rates of disability present in this region. And if we remember, West Virginia ranked in as #1 disability state in the nation, as this may be a risk factor for high levels of chronic pain. Research has also suggested that prescription drug use may not be perceived as high risk in comparison with other forms of drug use by individuals living in Appalachia. Prior studies have suggested that the use of nerve pills, sedatives, were perceived as less risky than other types of illegal drug-using behaviors, such as smoking marijuana, using cocaine, or crack. Numerous studies indicate that substance abuse and other mental health resources are lacking in rural areas, and Appalachian rural men in particular are the least likely group to seek treatment for illicit drug use as well as standard medical care. And lastly, I wanted to look at incarceration rates by gender, specifically using West Virginia as a sample of the Appalachian population. And as we've learned in class, incarceration does not help, especially in terms of nonviolent crime, for improving a marginalized male population. And even though over the course of between 1980 and 2015, both women and men incarcerations have both gone up in the state of West Virginia, in 2015 there was 865 women in prison versus 6,253 men in prison. And that's a pretty big difference. In summary, Appalachia was settled by men and their families looking for solitude away from the settled East Coast, to live off the land, and for opportunity. The Civil War impacted the Appalachian population negatively, financially, and psychologically not long after the settlement. The railroad expansion and exploitation of natural resources resulted in a capitalist pyramid which left the Appalachian population, and especially men, in more poverty and highly dependent on the welfare system. The Appalachian family dynamic, in particular the male role, was able to remain mostly stable and rooted in tradition until the 1970s, when mainstream culture made its way into the Appalachian home, and this pressured men to adapt to new ways after generations of tradition. Some men were able to adapt, while many resisted and retreated back to traditional living styles as a way to preserve independence and personal choice. Today, severe financial disparities are present throughout Appalachia and are particularly evident in the state of West Virginia, and much of central Appalachia faces profound healthcare disparities. The history and research I reported on that was published in 1979 is still largely true today. Appalachian men have a large amount of mistrust in the government and the healthcare system. They feel that remaining in rural Appalachia allows for the preservation of their independence and personal autonomy. Traditional folk culture causes internal conflict for these men who are dependent on welfare services, as they feel they are no longer the provider and decision maker in the house. In essence, this directly impacts male health care insurance rates, male willingness to seek preventative medical resources, and the willingness to adapt to behavior change. Studies show that Appalachian men in most categories of substance use have an earlier age of use. Despite insignificant findings regarding age of use for opioids and heroin, with oxycodone as the only exception, men are more likely to exhibit lifelong use and dependency for heroin, alcohol, crack cocaine, methamphetamine, marijuana, and hallucinogens. Studies have shown that rural America perceives the use of prescription drugs as safer than the use of illicit drugs, which is absolutely a gateway to illicit drug use. Appalachian West Virginia men have significantly higher rates of suicide, HIV, AIDS, occupational fatalities, and incarceration rates. Central Appalachia is represented by a disproportionate amount of disability for those aged 65 and under. Overall, Appalachian men are most at risk for preventable and acute health conditions and fatalities due to fatalistic and masculine attitudes. In conclusion, although I did not find a distinct difference between male and female prescription and illicit opioid use, I conclude, based on aforementioned points, including history, economic disparities, male retreat from mainstream culture, a history of welfare dependence, male mistrust in the medical system, physicians, and the government, and persisting male Appalachian folk subculture values and identity directly influence an increased male lifetime use of opioids and associated health risks and fatalities. In 2016, West Virginia experienced 232 fatal female overdoses and 501 fatal male overdoses. The Appalachian male unwillingness to adapt to mainstream culture and medicine is persistent and alive. I believe our healthcare system, education system, and government instead need to adapt to help these men and their families overcome struggles which are rooted in hundreds of years of marginalization and disparity.